In this video, I'll be giving you a brief overview of our landscape pipeline and the way that we set up a non-destructive and bidirectional relationship and workflow between Houdini and Unreal. We also set up our pipeline to try to facilitate collaboration between multiple artists insofar as that is needed. So what you see before you is the landscape as produced by Ian in an earlier video. And my responsibilities basically involved taking this into Unreal, doing the technical setup and implementation, and then doing additional procedural detailing, texturing, and setting up the material on the landscape. So we're just going to go through our thinking and the way in which we take advantage of caching and edit layers, sort of separating the layers of detail to facilitate as collaborative and non-destructive a workflow as possible. First of all, this was Ian's landscape, as we see here. And I'm just going to jump down to the end result that we have, which is our final island inside of Project Pegasus, which contains a lot more procedural detail that's been layered on top, as well as some manual sculpting work that's been done. Now, of course, if this manual sculpting work was to just be done naively on top of the basic height field, then it would have been a destructive modification, and it wouldn't be easy or possible to get back to this original pristine state that we had here. So we separated out these stages of work into 3 separate height fields, or in Unreal's case, edit layers. We can see that we have our first layer here, which we will now refer to as our source. And this is the work that Ian had done up to the point that I took over. We then have another height field, which we'll refer to as our manual layer. So this is another layer that gets imported into the Unreal landscape system as a separate edit layer. And then finally, we have the procedural detail layer, which is basically the result of some processes that happen inside of Houdini, which takes advantage of the information contained both within the procedural layer, the original work by Ian, and the manual modifications done inside of Unreal. So this procedural kind of final detailing stage happens with full context of the height field. Okay, so right now, those 3 height fields are just being referenced from 3 separate files on disk. So these are our caches. We have our source, manual edits, and procedural detail. Houdini is responsible for writing to the source and procedural detail layers. Unreal is responsible for writing to the manual edit layers. Houdini reads from the source and manual edits, and Unreal reads all 3. So it's sort of a bidirectional relationship going on there, which allows changes in one environment to be reflected inside of the other without sort of destroying the work that happened previously. On the Houdini end, to facilitate easier collaboration without constantly need to remember where the cache is and which files to use and how to blend them, we created a load landscape digital asset. So if I just click on this here, we can see that we've got a basic interface. Our first option here allows us to set the environment, which we'll be leaving on Houdini here, as well as the location of the cache. So if you're using the environment variables for Project Pegasus, then this should just work out of the box. You have the option to reload the cache there. And then we have checkboxes for which of those caches or which of those landscape layers we want to load, and they're automatically combined here inside of Houdini, as well as some color and ID related visualizations, which I'll get to in a minute. You'll see that as I go through and turn off these layers in turn, we're able to see how the different layers get combined together. And for the most part, this is just an additive blend between 3 height fields or edit layers. If we go and have a brief look at these other 2 checkboxes, color and ID, we can see the result of the other work that went into the landscape in order to texture it. And although the preview here is a little bit saturated and funky looking, you can sort of see where we'll be getting to later in this series. And here we have the ID map or splat map. that's responsible for texturing. And the reason that we included those inside of this load landscape HDA is just so that we have full context, and just with dragging a single digital asset, we can see sort of the culmination of all of the work on the landscape and use that to sort of feed into other pipelines and workflows like Ian did with his cliffs. So that's responsible for the reading into a Houdini of the landscape. We also have digital assets that read that landscape into Unreal. In fact, the load landscape digital asset is the same asset that's responsible for loading the landscape into Houdini. We just have to go and change the environment to Unreal. We'll see that the interface changes. If we just preview that here, we don't see anything. And that's simply because this digital asset is set up for reading the height fields into Unreal in a format that Unreal is comfortable with and understands. So that's why we don't see anything there. And then finally, we have our cache landscape. And so this one lives inside of Unreal 2. And essentially, this little digital asset is just the one that's responsible for exporting the manual edits from Unreal to disk so that they can then be read again inside of Houdini and reflect the latest changes. Okay, so that's everything on the Houdini side. And I'll be doing another video where we look at how we set up this load landscape digital asset and the caching. So if you're more technically inclined, then you can follow along with that. But if you'd just like to learn how to work with the tools that we've created and sort of get an overview of the pipeline, then just continue watching this series. And right now we're just going to jump inside of Unreal and take a look at how we can read in that landscape. Okay, so I've booted up Unreal, and first of all, I'm going to go and create a new level, which uses world partition. Now that we're here, I'm going to navigate to, I'm going to just kind of search the content browser for the load landscape digital asset. And we can see that there's quite a lot of different files here that are being popped up. So I'm just going to make sure that I go to filters, other filters. I think it's other filters. Perhaps it's miscellaneous. Whoops. There, miscellaneous. And then we're going to turn on Houdini assets. So that's going to populate the filters bar here with digital asset, with Houdini assets. And that allows us to now see the one that we're after. I'm going to go ahead and drag in the load landscape actor. I probably should have actually right-clicked it and clicked instantiate at the origin. But what I'm going to do now that it's there is I'm just going to zero it out manually. The reason we want it at the origin is so that the position of the height field matches what we have inside of Houdini. And now that we've pulled that into the world there, I'm just going to go down to the settings of the digital asset. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to go ahead and click Do Not Generate Outputs because I don't want it to do anything without me telling it to for the time being. And I'm going to set the environment to Unreal. We'll see that the UI changes there. And I'm just going to quickly peruse the settings and make sure that I'm happy with everything. So we have a force reload button, which I can ignore for the time being. We have a directory, which is using the environment variable Pegasus project. Now, sometimes this doesn't work in Unreal, so we might have to do something about that. And then we have a couple more parameters. So we first of all have the mode, and this is important. So by default, we should leave this on create new since we don't have a landscape in the world. But once we have a landscape and we've baked it to an actor inside of Unreal, we can change this setting to update existing. And then instead of trying to create a new landscape every single time you re-import some changes, it'll just update what's already there. And that's much faster as well and much more seamless. So we'll be wanting to do that in a second. And then we have the layer that we want to import inside of Unreal slightly differently to Houdini. We're just going to import one layer at a time. And essentially, this is just so that we have complete clarity over sort of which layer we want to import at any given moment, rather than trying to redundantly re-import all three, which would also be a bit slower. Okay, so for now, we're just going to try the settings as they are. And I'm going to go ahead and untick Do Not Generate Outputs. And for the time being, we don't see anything in the world there. And I think it's going to be because of that directory issue there. So what we're going to do is we're just going to click choose a directory from this computer. we're going to see that it did actually navigate us to the correct location, even though the digital asset didn't load the terrains. And we're just going to go ahead and click Select Folder. This may take a while, depending on your hardware, for the first load of the landscape. Okay, so it did take a little while, but it got there in the end. Don't worry, it won't take nearly that long once we switch this to updating an already baked landscape instance. So let's just fly up into the sky. If it's all black for you, just go and switch the viewport to unlit, and you'll see a grey rectangle, or if you get down nice and low, you'll see that we've actually got a landscape in the scene. Obviously, this isn't very helpful for visualization purposes, so before we do anything else, let's just go to the Quickly Add to Project drop down, go to Lights and add Directional Light, Skylight, and then just search Sky Atmosphere. Let's add in one of those too. And there we go, it's looking much better now for our preview purposes. So if we draw our attention back to the world outliner, we can see that it's been populated with a new landscape instance there. And this landscape is very much tied to and attached to the landscape HDA. And we want to break those links as quickly as we can so that we just have a native Unreal landscape in the scene. So what we're going to do is we're going to click back on our digital asset once more, and we're simply going to hit Bake. Now that should have been quite quick, and you might not have noticed anything changing, but if you look back at the outliner again, you'll see that we now just have a landscape called Landscape in the Scene. And if we just click the little drop down, we can see that it's already been broken up into a number of streaming proxies. So that's what tells us that World Partition has done its job with the Houdini engine, and we now have a nice segmented landscape ready to start world building in. So next up, we're going to just import our other layers to this landscape. So we need to go back down to the digital asset settings. And what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to change the mode from create new to update existing. And this will just refresh the height field, but you'll see it will be a lot quicker. There we go. So it did actually update that landscape there, but since the data was the same, nothing changed. And then we're just going to go through the layers one by one. Manual edits there. It might have frozen a bit for you, it did for me. And then if we fly over to the region of the landscape where those manual edits are supposed to be, we see them appear. Now, before we add the procedural details, let's just go to the landscape editing mode. And you can see that indeed, inside of the sculpting mode, we have two edit layers that have been created, layer 1 manual, and just the sort of source landscape, which is just called layer. And if I just toggle the layer visibility of manual, we can see that those changes now disappear. Okay, toggle that back on. And now I'll go back to regular selection mode. Click on the load landscape digital asset once more. And then I'm going to just click and select the procedural edits layer. You see that in a flash, those have already been loaded onto the terrain as well. We can see those kind of nice pathways that we'll be talking about in another tutorial. Okay, so just to check our sanity, we're going to go back to the landscape editing mode. We can press Shift-2 for a shortcut. And you can now see that it has indeed created a layer 2 procedural in addition to the manual. And we're just going to switch that off. Switch off manual. And you can see we have the ability to look at these different layers of detail and rest safe in the knowledge that we're not modifying our source terrain. And for extra security, we're just going to go to that padlock next to the source layer and click lock. I'm going to do the same on the procedural layer. And now we know that we can't accidentally make modifications inside of Unreal to either of those two layers. We can only modify the manual layer. So what if we did make some changes? If we go back, it should have stayed in the landscape mode. What if we did make some changes and start sort of sculpting around here and kind of pushing the terrain around and sort of sculpting it to perfection in the areas that we're going to be playing in? Well, once you're happy with your changes, we're going to go back to selection mode. And we're going to search for another digital asset, this time called cache landscape. You can see that we now have this SOP-P cache landscape digital asset, which we're going to drag into the world. We have to make sure that it's referencing the landscape. So you can see we've got a few parameters here. First of all, we need to go ahead and start the selection. We need to click on the landscape and then click Use Current. Oops, I just misclicked there. So now our cache landscape has that hooked up. And let's go ahead and try to cache those manual edits to disk. We may find that we've run into the same issue with the file path here. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Cache Manual Edits. Finished processing outputs. Okay, so no change in Unreal, which is to be expected. But if we go back to Houdini, go and have a look at our manual edits, we would expect to see a few spikes on the landscape. Maybe we need to reload the cache. No. So that tells me that we do indeed need to just do the same step we did previously. We're going to click on the geometry file under the Cache Manual Edits button. And we're just going to navigate this time to Landscape Height Field Layers. And we're going to choose that Manual Edits file, save. I'm going to retry Cache and Manual Edits. Back to Houdini. We're going to hit Reload. And two things happen. First of all, we can see that we do now have the spike on the terrain. But in addition to that, because of my sloppiness, you may have also noticed that the terrain is offset. And that's why it's very important whenever you drop a digital asset into the world that you instantiate it at the origin of the world, as opposed to just dragging it into the viewport. So we cache manual edits once more. See how quick that is, almost instant. Reload once more inside of Houdini. And curiously, that did not seem to work. So I'm just going to try to do a quick recook. Cache again. And load. And there we go. The recook did it. So not sure why that is. Potentially when we specified the landscape to be used on the cache actor inside of the selection option, perhaps it saved some offset information at that stage, which is why it required a little recook. So we have there now got our new manual modifications. And what if you're unhappy with these modifications and want to roll back? Well, I'm afraid that is something that I have not accounted for in the tooling. However, there is simply, if we go back to the cache location, a backup folder. We can just override those edits. And remember, if you're working with version control, you can always go back to an earlier revision of any specific file. So that's really it. That's our workflow. And with these two simple digital assets, creating a bridge between Houdini and Unreal, it's very easy to work in both softwares and to have them feed into each other and produce ultimately a more kind of well-crafted result and facilitate multiple people working together. In the next video, we're going to be going back to Houdini, and we're going to be looking at some of those procedural modifications that we started making to the terrain on top of the base work of Ian. All right, thanks. See you in the next one.